Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. Today we're going to be talking about what boards need to know about the non-GAAP issue. And joining me as an expert in this area is Terry Ward, who's a partner with PwC's Governance Insights Center. Terry, welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
So the center has just released a new publication with this pretty snappy title here called To GAAP or Non-GAAP? The SEC is watching. Mm-hmm. So maybe a good place to start, Terry, is, you know, non-GAAP issues are nothing new. It's been around for some time. So why is this sort of turned into a hot topic again?
Yeah, that's a good question, TK. Non-GAAP measures have been around for a long time. They were very popular in the 1990s. They're not new. But before I answer that question, I think what I want to do is lay a little groundwork on non-GAAP measures. And by that, what are the most popular non-GAAP measures are out there? And if you look at the S&P 500 and who uses non-GAAP measures, it's typically adjusted earnings per share and adjusted income or operating income. And so companies use those measures. They adjust GAAP measures for a variety of reasons to get to a non-GAAP measure to better communicate their message and exclude maybe a variety of items, but maybe non-recurring, unusual items. And so we believe that those have a purpose, meaning companies, non-GAAP measures serve a very viable purpose. They're a very good tool for companies to use to communicate their message and give a better analysis of operations and future prospects. But we also believe they have limits, and that's probably what we're going to talk about most here today. So getting back to your question, why is this a hot topic today? Well, there's three reasons that I really think about. One of them is more companies are using non-GAAP measures these days, and 88% of the S&P now use at least one non-GAAP measure. The other and maybe more significant item is that if you think about those measures, comparing GAAP to non-GAAP measures, the difference between those two is actually widening over time, such that non-GAAP income is becoming more favorable compared to GAAP income over time. And that has caught the eye of the SEC, and that's really the third point I have, is the SEC is clearly watching on this topic. There's been speeches by the SEC chair and SEC staff on this topic, and showing concern about non-GAAP measures. What really this all culminated in is in May, there's interpretive guidance issued by the SEC, which showed their concern in this area, and it had four themes that this interpretive guidance had. But I'm going to focus on just a couple of them I think that are most noteworthy. One of them is giving guidance on when non-GAAP measures could be potentially misleading. And some examples of those are that being inconsistent between periods. So if a company excludes a charge in the current period and has a like charge in the comparable period, well, to be fair and not be misleading, you really need to exclude that charge out of both of those periods. The same goes for an individual period, that if there's a charge being excluded to get from a GAAP to a non-GAAP measure, but there's also an unusual or infrequent gain in that same period, well, to be fair and not misleading, you really need to exclude both the charge and the gain. The third one, which is actually an example I have, is a little more difficult, and that is the SEC says you really shouldn't be excluding normal recurring cash expenses. That may seem pretty basic to most, but when you start getting into things like restructuring charges that companies have, some companies don't have restructuring charges hardly ever, very unusual or infrequent. Others have them potentially every year, every quarter. So it gets to be pretty judgmental of whether those should be adjustments to non-GAAP earnings or not. The other theme that I want to talk about is prominence. And the SEC has always indicated that GAAP measures should always be have equal or greater prominence when in a document that includes non-GAAP measures. And so they've given a little more guidance on that topic. And some examples are in an earnings release where these non-GAAP measures typically reside. If there's a heading that has a non-GAAP measure, well, there should also be the GAAP comparable amount to that, and that GAAP amount should be presented before that non-GAAP measure. So that's one example. The other one is they've even got into providing guidance in the text of earnings guidance, of earnings releases, that if non-GAAP guidance is presented in such a way that it's a larger font, it's in bold, it's in italicized, that it's actually given more prominence than it should. And one other example is in an earnings release, if there's tables, one's a GAAP table, one's a non-GAAP table, well, that GAAP table really should go before the non-GAAP table in cases like that. And if you summarize it all, what the SEC is saying is the non-GAAP measures really should supplement the GAAP information and not supplant it, is what they've really been saying.
So I understand, and particularly with the complexity, that the non-GAAP is occurring more. It's very complex, okay, in the sense that a lot of directors are going to have problems getting their arm around it. But
Yes.
it seems to me, can you just summarize sort of like what is the underlying issue? Have people been fraudulent with this? Have they been too aggressive? Or why again, the SEC bubbling up?
And that's a good question, because there really is a core issue here. And unfortunately, the issue is really a loss of trust by investors in non-GAAP information and a healthier level of skepticism. So if you think of what I just went through, and those three factors is more companies are using non-GAAP information, and only 12% of the S&P 500 are not using non-GAAP measures in communicating in earnings releases. That difference is widening between GAAP and non-GAAP, which is probably the focus of the concern. And the SEC is watching closely. And the SEC, in their guidance, if you really look at it, is focused so much on whether these measures are potentially misleading, which is obviously a substantive item. And they're kind of saying, are companies painting too rosy of a picture of their financial information by using the non-GAAP measures? But there's a couple other things, though, that I haven't yet mentioned that really add to that loss of trust. And that is, non-GAAP measures are not audited. Auditors are really on the sidelines as it relates to non-GAAP measures, and typically not involved. And so there isn't that level of oversight. And the other is the process companies use to calculate their non-GAAP measures many times isn't covered by their internal controls over financial reporting. A lot of us call SOX controls because it's not in the financial statements. So it may be covered by other disclosure controls and procedures, but they may be less formal, less documented, maybe not tested. So the internal process of companies over that process of non-GAAP adjustments may not be as robust. So you kind of add those together, and investors do have a reason for being skeptical and maybe losing a little bit of trust.
So all this kind of seems to come under the purview from the board level of the audit committee. Okay, so for our viewers, my simple question is, where does the audit committee fit in, and what's their role relative to this non-GAAP issue?
Well, that's a good question, because the audit committee is really in a position, especially now, to play a role in building trust in non-GAAP measures. In my experience, I haven't witnessed or seen audit committees do what I'd call a deep dive into non-GAAP measures, how they're calculated and why they're there. But I think now's the time. The interpretive guidance that the SEC just issued, I think, will result in changes to companies' earnings releases, maybe in terms of what non-GAAP measures are provided, but at least how they're calculated and the prominence surrounding their communication. So I think audit committees are in a great position to question some of those items. So our piece that you mentioned on non-GAAP measures of PwC has a list of questions that audit committees can ask of management to kind of do a bit of a deep dive. And so let me run through a few of those. Maybe most notable is, I think, just backing up and asking the question of why is this non-GAAP measure being provided? Is it useful to investors? Have investors provided feedback on that non-GAAP measure? And if so, what has that feedback been? Meaning, is that even the right non-GAAP measure to be providing? But other questions I think to ask are, what purpose does it serve internally, or does it serve any internal purpose? Does it drive management compensation? So how much substance is behind that non-GAAP measure? I think another one is getting back to the notion of, is the company's process to calculate the non-GAAP measures robust enough? Is it covered by the company's SOX controls? Is it covered by maybe some other controls that maybe aren't as formal? And is there judgment involved? And if so, what level of management is involved in that calculation? So a lot can be done just in terms of that calculation. The other is kind of getting at what you referred to as, is there potentially even some earnings management going on here? And if there is judgment in non-GAAP measure, does management have a bias to adjust those to make sure that they're meeting earnings guidance, for instance? And is there a judgment in that area? And then it gets back to, are some of those used for compensation purposes? So certainly that line of questioning by audit committees would be fully appropriate. The other part is, I think, is also stepping back and saying, is the disclosure that the companies had over non-GAAP measures fair and balanced? Is it painting too rosy of a picture? And as an audit committee, I think it's a good position they're in to be able to make that judgment. There's a lot of disclosure that's actually required that I haven't talked about by the SEC rules, but I think the audit committee is in a good position to be able to guess or to address that. The other is, and I think in the end, it's, again, I mentioned, I think these rules are going to cause changes in companies' disclosures in press releases. And so I think now's the time for a deep dive for audit committee to ask, how have you complied with the new interpretive guidance by the SEC? What judgments have been made, and really what process have you gone through to get comfortable that that process is robust?
Well, it's all good advice, Terry. So where can people get a copy of the GAAP or non-GAAP the SEC is watching?
Well, it's very easy, and it's probably an easy Google search to Google PwC Governance Insights Center, and once you get to our page, you'll find a library of our materials, and front and center will be our piece on non-GAAP measurements, at least for now.
Well, Terry, I want to thank you for taking the time. This, again, is a pretty complex topic, but something certainly that the audit committee, well, all board members need to be aware of it, but the audit committee in particular needs to be on top of this issue. And I want to offer one other piece of advice. The Center for Audit Quality, who we have on the show from time to time, also has a publication called Questions on Non-GAAP Measures, a Tool for Audit Committees. In addition to covering some of the issues that PwC does, it also covers the current regulation as well as the auditor's role in this area. So I think both publications would be good, and again, Terry, we appreciate your time in coming. That will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.